It was reasonably secluded, um, largely happy, but there was a mystery in it that I think provoked my imagination. Um, Namely, no adult in my family would ever tell me anything about who my father was. Um, I knew from an older cousin, only 4 years older than I am, um, everything or what little I could discover about him. I mistakenly thought that he and my mother were married and divorced before I was born. As it turned out, I was born in 1942, and my parents didn't divorce until 1944 when I was two. But I was born with that father's name, John Wallace Blunt Jr. Um, and It probably was a gift to my imagination that my mother wouldn't talk about him. Because when information of that kind is denied you as a child, um, you begin to invent who your father might have been. Um, and This becomes a secret, a private obsession, which I would say is an apt description of writing novels and screenplays, of making things up in lieu of knowing the real answer. Uh, I was 39 and divorcing my first wife when my mother deposited on my dining room table um, some letters from my father, which were written from an air base in India and from hospitals in India and China in 1943. He was a flyer. He flew the Himalayan route, the hump as it was called. He and his crew were shot down over Japanese-occupied Burma and hiked some 15 days, 225 miles later, into China. The letters were all patiently, painstakingly explaining to her why he didn't want to remain married to her, but that he hoped to have some contact with me. My mom never permitted him that contact. In 1948, when I was 6, she remarried, and my stepfather, Colin Irving, legally adopted me, so that my name was changed from John Wallace Blunt Jr. to John Winslow Irving, Winslow being my mom's maiden name. And the mystery continued. I think it probably is the most central or informative part of my childhood is what I didn't know about it. And As friends and critics have been saying of my novels for some time, I've been inventing that missing parent, that absent father in one novel after another. It was both a surprise, but an easing of a burden when, in the middle of the novel I just finished, which I began in 1998 and finished only this spring. In 2002, December of 2002, in the middle of that book, which was once again a missing father novel, I was contacted by a 39-year-old man named Chris Blunt who said, there's a possible chance that I might be your brother. And of course I knew it was not a possible chance at all, but a likelihood. And I since have met two brothers and a sister I didn't know about. And I found out more about this man who died 5 years before Chris found me. And the coincidences of the father I was imagining, who was waiting for me to finish my story in the last two chapters of this novel. The actual father turned out to have some similarities to the man I'd already imagined. Not as surprising as you might think, given the fact that when you're a kid and you don't know about someone, it's natural to demonize him. In other words, if nobody would talk about this guy, how bad a guy was he? Or there must have been something wrong with him, or people would have talked to me. At least that's always the way my imagination runs. Imagine the worst, right? Imagine the worst. Well, it was nice to hear from these two brothers and my one sister that they loved him, that they thought he was a good father, although he was married 4 times and had children with 3 of those wives, not the 4th. It was astonishing for the first time to see in my late 50s, early 60s, which I was at the time, photographs of my father when he's younger than my grown children are today. I have a 40-year-old son and a 36-year-old son, and I'm looking at pictures of Lieutenant John Wallace Blunt when he's 24 with his flight crew in China. And he doesn't, to me, to my eyes, look like me, although he does. What he really looks like is one of my kids, right? Or he so much more closely resembles them than he does me. I was a moody kid. I was an aloof kid. I kind of kept to myself. I liked, I think that an early sort of pre-writing indication that I had the calling to be a writer was how much time I liked to spend alone. I wasn't antisocial. I had friends, but I didn't really want to hang out with them after school. What I saw of them at school was enough. I needed to be in a room by myself even before I was writing, just imagining things, just thinking about things. If there was a weekend with too many cousins or other people around, I got a little edgy. I think the need to be by myself, which I've recognized in a couple of my own children, is one that was respected by my grandmother, with whom I lived until my mom remarried, as I told you, when I was 6. And I was fortunate to be in a big house, my grandmother's house, and there were lots of places to get off by herself and imagine those things I didn't know. I find I'm 63, and my capacity to be by myself and just spend time by myself hasn't diminished any. That's a necessary part of being a writer. You better like being alone. Well, before I went to college anyway, when I was still in prep school, 14, 15, I started keeping notebooks, journals. I started writing almost like landscape drawing or life drawing. I never kept a diary. I never wrote about my day and what happened to me, but I described things. I did, if I'd known how to draw, maybe I would have drawn hundreds of pictures of my grandmother's garden. But instead I wrote sort of landscape descriptions of it. I think that was what was so compelling to me about those Dickens and Hardy novels, that just the lushness of detail, the amount of description, the amount of atmosphere that is pumped into those novels. It's like nothing you read today, except from those writers who are essentially 19th century storytellers themselves. The Canadian Robertson Davies, the German Günter Grass, Garcia Marquez, Salman Rushdie. Basically, old-fashioned 19th century plot-driven storytellers. Among my contemporaries, I still like the old-fashioned ones. Some exceptions, to be sure. I mean, Graham Greene is such a good storyteller that I forgive him for being as modern as he is, you know. But I was never a Hemingway person. I never understood that. In Moby Dick, there was a story. The longer, the better. You know. I remember kids who were reading Moby Dick in a class with me just complaining about do we have to know everything about the whaling industry? Do we have to read about the blubber and all of the rest of it? I couldn't get enough of it, you know. I couldn't get enough of it. I don't begin a novel until or a screenplay, until I know the ending. And I don't mean only that I have to know what happens. I mean that I have to hear the actual sentences. I have to know what atmosphere the words convey. Is it a melancholic story? Is there something uplifting or not about it? Is it sorrowful? Is it mournful? Is it exuberant? What is the language that describes the end of the story? And I don't want to begin something. I don't want to write that first sentence until all the important connections in the novel are known to me, as if the story has already taken place, and it's my responsibility to put it in the right order to tell it to you. Do I begin at the beginning chronologically? Sometimes. Or is it the kind of story that's better to jump into in the middle and go backwards and forwards at the same time? I personally just can't make those judgments. I can't come to those decisions unless I know what's waiting for me at the end. What makes this story worth the 5 years it's going to take me to write it? What is emotionally compelling enough at the end of this novel? What's waiting for you that's going to move you at the end of this story that makes a reader tolerate how long and complicated and at times difficult it's going to be? And so I always go there. I write those end notes as if they were to pieces of music. So I know what I'm going to hear at the end of the story. I know what the sentences themselves, what they're going to sound like. And I put them on a wall, you know, and they're waiting for me. And I know I'm not going to get to that part of the story for 4, 5, in the case of this most recent novel, 7 years. But it's important to me that I hear it. In the world according to Garp, we are all terminal cases. First sentence I wrote, last sentence of the book. Oh God, please give him back. I shall keep asking you. A prayer for Owen Meany. First sentence I wrote. The whole novel is a prayer, but what's the prayer at the end? What does the narrator want? He wants him back. I have to know those things. And I think working my way through that process, begin with the end, and then work your way back to where you begin. Sometimes that's a year, sometimes it's 18 months, where all I'm doing is taking notes. I'm reconstructing the story from the back to the front so that I know where the front is. Now, people always ask me, well, surely something changes. Surely somewhere along the way you get a better idea. In the sequence of events in the middle of the story, that's often true. Sometimes a character I'd never thought of, a minor character or a major minor one, will make an appearance in the middle of the story and move the story in a slightly different way. But the ending never changes. It never has. Never has. 11 novels never changed. I might fool around with that first sentence over time, but I won't fool around with the last. It's it's as clear as a note of music. It's just it is where I'm going, and I could no more imagine writing a novel without knowing those things than I could imagine coming home from the airport and saying to my wife, an amazing thing just happened when I landed, if I didn't know what it was. I'm not that good a pathological liar to sort of pull that one off. At the time, they didn't have the language for it that we have perhaps in overabundance today. Dyslexia, learning disabilities, whatever they are. I had something of that nature and never knew I had it until one of my children was diagnosed as being slightly dyslexic. And when they showed me the results of how they determined that he had a learning disability, I realized that they were describing exactly what I had always done. I just, what it amounted to in essence was that if I would ask my friends, how long did the history assignment take you? How long did the English assignment take you? And if they said, oh, it's 45 minutes, I would just double the time or triple the time. And I'd say, well, it's an hour and a half for me. I just knew that everything was going to take me longer, right? Well, I don't think that's a bad disability to have if you're going to write long novels. There's no reason you should write any novel quickly. There's no reason you shouldn't, as a writer, not be aware of the necessity to revise yourself constantly. And surely as much as more than a half, maybe as much as 2/3 of my life as a writer is rewriting. If I have, I wouldn't say I have a talent that's special, as that it strikes me I have an unusual kind of stamina. I can rewrite sentences over and over again, and I do. And the reshaping of something, the restructuring of a story, the building of the architecture of a novel, the craft of it is something I never tire of. And maybe that comes from what homework always was to me, which was redoing, because I always made mistakes. And I always assumed I would. And that meant that my grades weren't very good, and that meant that school was hard for me. But when I got out of school and my focus could go to the one thing I wanted to do, the novel, the screenplay of the moment, I knew how to work. I knew how to concentrate, because I had to. I read Charles Dickens when I was 14 or 15. Might be hard for many 14, 15-year-olds today to read Dickens. That language seems so old-fashioned, if not exactly dated to us now. The amount of detail, the sheer complexities of those stories and plots. But those were the novels I read that made me want to write novels. If I'd read, frankly, some more modern or postmodern novels at the time, I might have wanted to do something else. I've always been a fan of the 19th century novel, of the novel that is plotted, character-driven, and where the passage of time is almost as central to the novel as a major minor character, the passage of time and its effect on the characters in the story. Those old 19th century novels, all of them long, all of them complicated, all of them plotted. Not just Dickens, but especially Dickens, but also George Eliot, Thomas Hardy. And among the Americans, Melville and Hawthorne always meant more to me than Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald. I'm not a modern guy. You got to be disciplined. I think the sport of wrestling, which I became involved with at the age of 14, I competed until I was 34. Kind of old for a contact sport. I coached the sport until I was 47. I think the discipline of wrestling and has given me the discipline I have to write. There's a kind of repetition that's required in any of the martial arts and in some other sports as well, but especially in the martial arts sports. You repeat and repeat over and over again the dumbest things, the simplest moves, the simplest defenses, until they become like second nature. But they don't start out that way. And I think what I've always recognized about writing is that I don't put much value in so-called inspiration. The value is in how many times you can redo something. The value is in the importance of the refrain. The third time you repeat something, it has more resonance than the second time you repeat something, if it's good enough to begin with, right? So much of a sport like wrestling is drilling, is just repeating and repeating and repeating, so that you've done this thing so many times that if somebody just touches your arm on that side, you know where to go. You could do it with your eyes closed. If you're off your feet and you're up in the air, if you've been there enough, you know where the mat is. You know it's here, it's not there. You just know where it is. You don't have to see it, but you've been through that position enough so that you're not looking for the mat. You're not thinking, is it up here? Is it down there? Am I going to land on my head? Am I going to land on my tail? You know, it's just, well, I think sentences are like that. If you're comfortable enough with all kinds of sentences, with verbs in their gerundive, with active verbs, with short sentences, with long sentences, you know how to put them together. You know how to slow the reader down when the reader is at a place where you want the reader to move slowly, and you know how to speed the reader up when you're at a place in the story where you want the reader to go fast. And it's drilling, it's repetition. Most people would find it boring, like sit-ups, like skipping rope. But I could put my mind somewhere else while I skipped rope for 45 minutes. People think, how can, you have to be dumb to skip rope for 45 minutes. No, you have to be able to imagine something else. While you're skipping rope, you have to be able to see something else. You have to imagine that your next opponent stopped skipping rope 15 minutes ago. Then you keep going. Well, in that case, because it was a historical novel and I knew the history, I was cheating a little bit because, of course, I knew how it was going to end up. There was an interesting story at the end of the war in Vienna, which the Russians got to first, that all during the war, the animals in the Hietzinger Zoo, near the Schönbrunn Palace, on the outskirts of Vienna, a suburb of Vienna, really, those animals in the Hietzinger Zoo were somehow fed and protected from all the air raids, all the attacks. Nobody broke into that zoo and ate those animals, killed those animals, took them home for dinner, although the city was starving. Somebody looked after the animals, and when the cages were blasted or bombed, somebody rebuilt the cages, although the zoo itself was in virtual rubble by the end of the war. But when the Russians got to Vienna, the zoo was empty. The animals were gone. Because Viennese realized, of course, and no one's ever written about this. No one really. This is just a fact. The Russians went to Hietzing because there's some big animals out there, or so they imagined. But there were no animals out there. So the idea of the people of Vienna keeping those animals alive for the course of the war, and then when they realized that, well, the Russians were going to take everything they could get when they got there, so we're not leaving them for the Russians. That was kind of the background to the history. That and the Yugoslav theater of the war, Mikhailovich and what happened to him. I think writing a historical novel about how two young Austrian students are connected through ancestry to that story, and who get the idea, ill-advised, as many young people's ideas are, to free those animals, to let them go, to stage a zoo bust, because the period of the war has marked their lives, but at the same time they were never a part of it. It's somebody else's generation. It was somebody else's war. This novel, which was first published at the time of the Vietnam War, nobody saw the parallels, the degree of protest that was in it, the spirit of sort of demonstration with which it was written. It got good reviews here, but American reviewers, they weren't as knowledgeable about Austria in World War II as I was. I'd been a student in Vienna, and that was one of the neat little things I found out was about that zoo. And so it was a good debut novel for me to have published. I was 26 or 27 when it was published. I already had a kid and would soon have a second. I'd had a child when I was still an undergraduate. I kind of did everything early. I have a pretty thick skin. And I think if you're going to be in this business, if you're going to be an actor or a writer, you better have a thick skin. You don't want to dwell on your enemies, you know. I basically feel so superior to my critics for the simple reason that they haven't done what I do. Most book reviewers haven't written 11 novels. Many of them haven't written one. So I try not to take very seriously what someone who can't do what I do says about what I do. It's different when you're reviewed by a fellow novelist. The best reviews I've had have all been written by fellow novelists, novelists who occasionally, but not regularly or professionally, write book reviews. That's just the way it is. Margaret Drabble's review of The World According to Garp, Robertson Davies' review of The Hotel New Hampshire, Frank Howard Mosher's review of The Cider House Rules, Stephen King's review of A Prayer for Owen Meany, Bharati Mukherjee's review of A Son of the Circus, William Boyd's review of My Movie Business, Jay Perini's review of The Fourth Hand, Carol Shields' review of A Widow for 1 Year. These are all working novelists, and they're all novelists that I respect. So quelle surprise that they should respect me. They do what I do. They're qualified to evaluate what I do because they do what I do. Most critics aren't qualified. It's as simple as that. The foremost advice I had to give them is that they better read everything they can. They better read. They better read as many good books as they can. They better put the literature of the world into storage somewhere because they're going to need it. The truth is, if you get to be a writer, especially if you get to be a self-supporting one, which means you get to write all day, nothing else gets in your way. If you get to do that, what happens is you'd rather be writing than reading. And I'm not a good reader anymore because I write all the time, literally all the time. Well, I'm glad. I feel lucky that I was a good reader as a kid because I don't know when else I would have done it. I'm not embarrassed that I'm not much of a reader now because I'm not slacking. You know, I write 7 days a week. I can write 8 hours a day. Not everybody can do that. I couldn't do that 20 years ago, but I can do it now. 20 years ago, when I wasn't writing screenplays concurrently with whatever novel I'm writing, I was a better reader. I used to read a lot of things when I was between one novel and not yet started in the next. But now I'm never between things because when I finish a draft of a novel, I go immediately to 1 or 2 or 3 uncompleted screenplays. I just go back and forth. There's always something on my desk. There's always something I can be writing, and I'd rather be writing than reading.